Hey guys, tonight we drift into one of those old, half-forgotten fairy tales that feels like it's been waiting in the quiet shadows of history just for you. Picture this. The air is cool, the night is soft, and mist unrolls across a river like someone spilled a bucket of silver paint on black velvet. You're standing there at the edge, shoes damp from grass, half tempted to jump in, but don't worry, you probably won't survive this, at least not without a towel. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know your location and your local time down in the comments. I always love seeing the little constellation of listeners scattered across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The mist clings to your ankles as you walk along the riverbank, curling and uncurling like it's alive, like it's got better things to do than just hang around looking mystical. You follow it, even though your brain is telling you this is the exact setup for every folktale where someone disappears for 100 years and comes back just in time to find their house turned into a Starbucks. The river itself moves slowly, lazily, as if the moon has whispered to it, "Relax, nobody's timing you." Reeds sway in the still air, brushing together like sleepy violin strings, and each step you take muffles into damp earth. You can almost hear the water breathing. That's when you notice the mist isn't random. It's curling across the river, gathering into strands that seem to point you towards some hidden place upstream. Here's a neat historical nugget. In many European folk traditions, rivers were more than just waterways. They were thresholds. To cross a river was to cross into another realm. That's why so many myths begin with someone standing hesitantly on a riverbank, debating whether to wade in. The Celts believed rivers had guardian spirits. The Norse whispered about elves or Norns waiting by the water. And the Greeks? Well, they had entire afterlife fairies built around rivers. Talk about overachievers. And speaking of overachievers, did you know there's an actual place in Ireland where mist rises from the River Shannon in such thick sheets that locals once believed it was fairy smoke? They said the fairies were boiling milk underground, and the mist was just the steam escaping. Imagine explaining that in a weather forecast. Chance of fairy cooking haze, light wind out of the west. But back to you. Your feet crunch along the bank until the path narrows into a thin ribbon. The mist thickens, wrapping around your knees now, and the sound of the river hushes into a kind of muffled heartbeat. Every once in a while you think you hear laughter, faint and musical, like someone telling jokes on the other side of the water. Probably swans, or ghosts, but probably swans. The air carries a smell of wet stone, moss, and that faint iron tang rivers always seem to have. You breathe it in, and suddenly the whole world feels centuries old. You start imagining monks in brown robes carrying lanterns here, or fishermen tying up their boats with ropes that look like they've seen 1,000 storms. Funny thing is, folktales love these riverbank beginnings because they set the mood for the impossible. This is the stage, and the mist is the curtain, and behind it waits something both ordinary and enchanted. Now, folklorists still argue whether tales like the Swan Maiden are born from shamanic shape-shifting traditions, or if they're just cautionary stories about not marrying strangers who show up with suspiciously good skin. Some say the swan robe is symbolic of freedom. Others think it's just, swan couture. Either way, you're about to see why people kept retelling this story for centuries, passing it down like a whispered secret you only share at night. You stop, because the mist finally thins, just enough to reveal a widening in the river. There, in the faint glow of moonlight, you catch sight of something shimmering, a lake hidden inside the folds of the valley, as though the river's been hoarding it all along. You blink once, twice, and the shimmer doesn't go away. This is it. This is the place where the story truly begins. And if you're thinking this is the part where things get a little strange, well, you're absolutely right. The hidden lake gleams like polished silver dropped into the middle of the valley, tucked away as if the earth itself had cupped its hands around it. You step closer, the grass damp against your ankles, and notice how the mist seems to pause here, like even fog respects boundaries. The water lies perfectly still, mirroring the moon so clearly that for a second you can't tell which way is up. You lean forward, half expecting to fall into the sky. The air is different here, quieter, denser. Your ears feel like they're underwater, catching every small ripple and distant rustle. Then you see them, swans. A whole company of them gliding across the lake's surface, as if choreographed by some invisible conductor. Their wings trail faint lines in the water, carving patterns that shimmer for only a heartbeat before melting away. Now, let's pause for a curious fact. Across European folklore, swans are the divas of water birds. Sure, geese can hiss at you like they're auditioning for a villain role, and ducks, well, ducks just quack around like feathered stand-up comedians. But swans? Swans are always royal, always otherworldly. In Norse legends, Valkyries were sometimes described as Swan Maidens, flying into battle and then slipping out of their feather robes to mingle with mortals. Meanwhile, in Celtic lore, enchanted children were famously transformed into swans for 900 years. Imagine the family reunion after that. Here's the quirky tidbit. Medieval towns in Europe sometimes passed laws protecting swans because they were considered noble birds. Killing one wasn't just rude, it was treasonous. Folklorists still debate whether this swan obsession came from actual religious symbolism or if people just didn't want to deal with swan-related lawsuits. Anyway, back at the lake, you stand there watching as the swans turn in elegant circles. One swan dips its head beneath the water, wings stretching like pale sails. Another drifts closer to shore, so close you can hear the soft splashing of its webbed feet pushing against the lake bed. It looks at you, or maybe it doesn't. It's hard to tell with swans. They've got that permanent "I'm silently judging you" expression, the same one baristas use when you order pumpkin spice in May. And then it happens. A flicker, a shift. You blink hard, because the swans aren't just swans anymore. For a moment you swear their feathers glimmer like garments, delicate and bright, as if woven from moonlight itself. It's gone in a heartbeat, but something lingers. The air smells faintly of wildflowers, though none grow nearby. You rub your eyes, wondering if the mist is playing tricks, or if the lake just let you glimpse what it's hiding. Scholars can't agree whether the Swan Maiden tales came from shamanic practices, where spiritual leaders donned animal skins to travel between worlds, or if they're metaphors for marriage, freedom, or the fear of losing autonomy. Personally, standing here, you think maybe the people who invented these tales just had really vivid evenings by lakes like this, because staring into this scene, it feels less like metaphor and more like memory, like the water itself remembers every version of the story ever told. The swans circle once more, wings catching the moonlight, and the whole lake seems to hold its breath. You do too, because you're beginning to sense that something is about to shift, that one of those gliding white shapes will break away from the rest, and the story will take its first true step. And honestly, you're not wrong. The lake's surface ripples as one swan eases away from the flock, moving toward the shore with a deliberate grace that feels almost human. You freeze, half hidden in the reeds, because this isn't your average breadcrumb-begging bird. No, this one glides as though she already knows the earth belongs to her just as much as the water. The swan reaches the shallows. There's a pause, like the whole scene has been holding its breath. Then, with a shake of wings so smooth, it might as well be a magician's flourish, the feathers seem to melt away. You blink once, twice, and there she is. A maiden, barefoot, her robe of swan feathers pooled at her feet like a spilled halo. Her hair catches the moonlight, strands glowing faintly as if they've stolen a few stars for themselves. If this feels like a surreal dream sequence, well, it is. But it's also straight out of folklore. In countless European versions, the Swan Maiden is described as shedding her feather robe to step into a human body. It's a shapeshifter's trick, a costume change worthy of Broadway. And yes, folklorists have been bickering about it for centuries. Is the feather robe a symbol of the soul, a stand-in for independence, or just a clever way to explain why someone suddenly appeared naked by a lake? Take your pick. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some versions, the robes weren't feathers at all, but literal cloaks sewn from swan skins. Imagine trying to hang that up in a medieval closet. Ah yes, next to my wolf pelt, right beside the spare dragon hide. Don't touch, it's dry clean only. The maiden bends down, her hands grazing the robe like it's both precious and dangerous. She looks around, at the reeds, the shadows, the river winding away into the dark. Her expression is quiet, searching. You hold your breath because there's a strange feeling that she could see you at any moment. And let's be honest, explaining why you're crouched in the bushes watching a magical bird undress, not your best moment. But she doesn't see you. Instead, she straightens and hums softly, a tune so delicate it seems woven from the mist itself. It's not just a lullaby. It's older, stranger, the kind of melody that makes your bones feel like they've suddenly remembered winter. Maybe it's a song carried down through centuries of swan maidens before her, or maybe it's just her way of reminding the lake that she belongs here more than you ever could. Historically, Swan Maiden stories span cultures far beyond Europe. Variants pop up in Siberia, in Asia, even in Native American lore where women transform with bird skins or robes. The common thread? Always the danger of someone taking that robe away. And here's the debate. Are these tales secretly about female agency, or are they cautionary myths warning men not to mess with magical women? Hard to say. Though, honestly, the idea that men could steal a woman's freedom by hiding her clothes? Not exactly a great look. Still, tonight you're in the story, and the story is unfolding whether you agree with it or not. The maiden kneels, dips her hands into the lake, and lets the water drip back through her fingers like liquid glass. Her swan sisters, if that's what they are, glide further into the mist, leaving her alone at the shore. She gazes after them, a flicker of sadness or maybe relief crossing her face. Then she turns her head, and for a heartbeat, it feels like she's looking directly at you. You jerk slightly, convinced the maiden's gaze has pinned you like a butterfly in a glass case. Her eyes linger on the reeds, on the silver haze curling in the air. But then she looks past, as if she's already accustomed to shadows holding watchers. You exhale, slow and shaky, trying not to rustle a single blade of grass. She kneels again, the swan feather robe still draped at her feet, soft as a snowfall. That's when you notice movement on the far side of the lake. A villager. Ordinary clothes, ordinary gait. The sort of man you might see hauling baskets of grain or fixing a creaky wheel. Slips along the path. He pauses, seeing her. His eyes widen, not with fear, but with something like opportunity? And here's where folklore takes its familiar, awkward turn. The man doesn't step forward with reverence or courtesy. No, he crouches low, tiptoeing toward the robe like it's a sack of coins left out overnight. With a quiet snatch, he lifts it from the ground. The feathers don't flutter, they almost sigh, as though the garment knows its fate. Now, let's put a pin in this for a second. Across dozens of cultures, the same pattern repeats. A man hides the magical garment of a maiden, whether swan skin, seal skin, or feather cloak, and suddenly she can't return to her world. Is this romantic? Is it theft? Is it both? Scholars still argue. Some frame it as a myth of transition, the spirit woman tethered to human life. Others call it what it looks like, a story of captivity disguised as love. Here's your quirky tidbit. In certain Arctic seal maiden legends, if a husband mistreated his stolen bride, she could still slip away, sometimes by sniffing out her pelt hidden under the floorboards. Which makes you wonder if folklore invented the first "I told you not to look in the basement" plotline. Back at the lakeside, the villager clutches the robe to his chest. The maiden straightens, sensing the air has shifted. Her humming stops. She turns, sees him, and her face stills into something unreadable. She steps toward him, hand outstretched, not pleading, not furious, just still. Like she knows the story is ancient and unbending, and she's playing her part. The man doesn't return the garment. He backs away, keeping it close, and gestures toward the village that lies hidden beyond the hills. His words don't reach you through the mist, but you imagine them. Come with me. Stay. Be mine. The maiden's shoulders rise and fall. Her gaze flicks to the lake, to her swan sisters circling like white echoes in the distance. Then back to him. For a long moment, the night is silent except for the faint lapping of water. And then, she follows. Barefoot, robeless, she walks beside him as though bound by invisible threads. The mist swallows them both, leaving only the shimmer of feathers on the ground where she once stood. The walk to the village is slow, the kind of quiet trek where even the crickets seem to hush in confusion. You trail behind at a distance, not because you've been invited, clearly you haven't, but because something in you can't look away. The maiden steps barefoot on the uneven earth, her robe hidden under the villager's arm like contraband. Her expression is calm, but there's a stillness to it, the kind of stillness that says, "I'm here, but not by choice." The village unfolds gradually, roofs thatched with straw, chimneys sending up thin threads of smoke. A dog barks once and then retreats, tail tucked, as though sensing the oddness of the scene. The man leads her to a modest wooden house, its door worn from years of knocks and storms. He pushes it open, and for the first time, she hesitates. Just a beat. Then she enters. And just like that, the story tilts. The maiden becomes a wife. You've probably heard versions of this setup before. Sometimes it's framed like destiny, other times like coercion with a side of, "Oops, my bad." Folklorists point out that in these tales, marriages often begin without consent, but somehow settle into rhythms of domestic life. Is it love? Stockholm Syndrome? An allegory about how women were historically married off without their say? Scholars can't agree. Though, to be fair, scholars can't even agree if Cinderella's slipper was fur or glass. So maybe don't bet on them solving swan ethics. Here's a curious historical nugget. In certain Norse ballads, the stolen swan wife scenario wasn't seen as tragic, but blessed. The man was thought to have secured not just a wife, but prosperity, luck, and children with unusual gifts. Which raises the question, did the villagers treat her as one of their own, or as a walking, talking lottery ticket? The quirky tidbit? Some Finnish versions describe the Swan Maidens as so otherworldly that their husbands had to keep them from singing in public because their voices could charm entire towns into forgetting chores. Imagine an entire medieval village just lying around while the goats wander off because someone hummed at breakfast. Back in the little wooden house, life reshapes itself. She tends the hearth, she kneads bread, she fetches water from the well. The man smiles more now, proud of the wife he won. Villagers nod approvingly, whispering their own tales of luck and mystery. Children laugh when they see her, drawn to her gentleness like moths to a lantern. And yet, there's always something distant in her eyes, a gaze that lingers too long on the river, a silence that clings when music drifts through the fields. One evening, the villagers gather for a festival. Fiddles scrape, mugs clink, feet stamp against wooden planks. The maiden dances when pulled into the circle, graceful as flowing water, but her smile fades the moment the music slows. She slips away to the edge of the celebration, staring out toward the misty line of trees. You watch her, and it's clear. Though her body dwells here, her spirit is still somewhere on that lake, where feathers once shimmered like dawn. Days roll into weeks, weeks into seasons, and you find yourself woven into the rhythms of Riverkind. Chickens scatter across cobblestones, their feathers less regal than swandown, but twice as noisy. Children chase each other past the well, laughing in the universal language of sticky fingers and scraped knees. And at the heart of it all, there she is, the Swan Maiden, moving through her new life like a candle flame sheltered by glass. She tends the hearth with quiet precision, laying logs as though she's sketching shapes in the fire. She draws water with hands that never quite lose their shimmer, even when streaked with mud. Neighbors whisper about her skill, how bread rises lighter in her care, how gardens she touches seem to bloom with suspicious eagerness. Nobody says the word magic out loud, of course. This is the kind of village where people prefer to call miracles good fortune and leave it at that. Here's a historical tidbit. In medieval Europe, villagers often explained unusual luck or talent by linking it to fairy blood. If your crops never failed or your cows gave milk sweeter than the rest, chances were someone would mutter about an ancestor who wasn't exactly human. Folklorists still debate whether these murmurs were meant as praise or suspicion. After all, being magical might earn you a loaf of bread or a trial. The quirky detail? In some Scandinavian folktales, swan maidens weren't just pretty faces, they were excellent housekeepers who apparently invented half the household hacks we still use today. Fold your linens with the precision of a swan maiden was the medieval equivalent of life hack TikTok. But in Riverkind, her gifts come with shadows. You notice her glances, the way her eyes linger on the river each time she carries water, the way her head tilts slightly when a bird passes overhead. She laughs when children tug her sleeve, but the sound always seems half-borrowed, like she's trying it on for size. Her husband, if that's the word you want to use, beams with pride. He calls her his treasure, his blessing, though sometimes his grip on her shoulder is just a little too firm, his smile just a little too fixed. Around the hearth, villagers nod approvingly, but you can't shake the sense that they're admiring not her, but the luck she represents. One afternoon, while tending the sheep in a meadow that rolls like green velvet, she pauses. The flock grazes without hurry, bells chiming softly, but she stands motionless. Then she hums. The same tune you heard by the lake, faint but unmistakable. The sheep lift their heads, ears twitching as though the melody carries some forgotten command. You realize the song isn't just for her, it's for everything listening, even the land itself. That's when you understand. She's living among them, yes, but she hasn't forgotten. Not the lake, not the feathers, not the sisters who still circled in the mist. Her life here is a woven cloth, warm and steady, but threaded through it is longing, bright and unhidden, like a streak of silver no loom can disguise. And you? You can't help but wonder how long a spirit born of water and wing can pretend to belong entirely to earth. It happens on a quiet evening, the kind of evening where the whole village seems to sink into a lullaby of its own. Pots clink faintly as neighbors finish their suppers, the river hums against its banks, and you find yourself outside the cottage watching the faint glow of firelight spill from its window. Inside, the Swan Maiden sits near the hearth, hands resting in her lap. At first, it seems she's just idly humming, but the sound grows, unfurling like threads of silk. It's the same tune she once sang by the lake, low, haunting, and so achingly beautiful that it makes your chest tighten. You lean closer because every note seems to pull something loose inside you, as though the music were carefully dismantling the scaffolding of your day. Here's a mainstream fact. In many cultures, music is inseparable from memory. The Greeks believed in Mnemosyne, goddess of memory, as the mother of the muses, so every song was literally born from remembering. Folklorists think that might explain why swan maidens are always singing. Their songs aren't just melodies, they're acts of remembrance. The quirky tidbit? In Icelandic folklore, there are accounts of women singing while spinning wool so rhythmically that listeners swore the thread itself carried the song. Imagine pulling on a sweater and hearing a lullaby woven into the sleeve. Cozy, but mildly terrifying. She hums a line, pauses, then sings again, her voice rising just slightly above the crackle of wood. The husband dozes in a chair nearby, chin resting on his chest, oblivious. Outside, even the wind seems to still, waiting. And in that silence, you realize something startling. She isn't singing to fill the air. She's singing to call something back. The walls seem to tremble with each note. You close your eyes, and you swear you hear more than one voice, like distant echoes answering across the water. The melody wraps itself around you, pulling you not forward, but backward, deeper into some ancient place that doesn't obey clocks or calendars. Folklorists still argue about whether these Swan Maiden songs were imagined as spells, prayers, or just narrative color. Maybe they were all three, because in this moment you feel the weight of centuries behind every note, as if every Swan Maiden who ever sang is joining her, layering their voices until the very air feels heavy with longing. She stops suddenly, as though catching herself. Her hands fold together. The room is still. The husband shifts, mutters something in his sleep, and settles back. She glances at him, expression unreadable, then back toward the window where the river gleams faintly under the moon. And you know, without needing words, that the song wasn't finished, that it waits, like the feathers she lost, for the right moment to take flight again. The next morning arrives soft and unhurried, sunlight dripping through the thatched roof like honey. The Swan Maiden is already at the riverbank, kneeling in the dew-damp grass. You join her quietly, and for a moment you pretend you're just another villager out for a stroll. Except, let's be honest, you're basically stalking her like a budget detective in a fairy tale trench coat. She's tracing ripples with her hand, as though the water might answer back. And maybe it does, because the longer you watch, the more the river seems to lean toward her touch, bowing like an obedient pet. Somewhere deep inside, you realize she isn't just longing for the river, she belongs to it. Historically speaking, rivers often carried divine associations. Ancient Egyptians considered the Nile a living deity. In Norse myths, rivers were literal daughters of ocean gods. Folklorists point out that the Swan Maiden's constant return to water is no accident. It's her identity calling her home, as if the current itself wrote her name on the world. Here's the quirky bit. In 19th century Germany, villagers sometimes believed swans were really enchanted brides left behind after weddings gone wrong. Swans lingering near rivers weren't just birds. They were tragic ex-wives, floating around with more grace than most people could muster after heartbreak. The Swan Maiden dips her fingers again, whispering words you can't quite catch. They slip into the current like silver fish. You lean closer, maybe a little too close, and accidentally step on a stick. The crack sounds like thunder. She whirls around. For a heartbeat, her eyes catch yours, wide and shimmering, not with anger, but with a kind of raw ache, like you've interrupted a private phone call she was having with the universe. She doesn't scold you. She just turns back. But you know she knows. There's no hiding that you're watching, no disguising the fact that the village life, the hearth, the laughter, it isn't enough for her. She needs the river. And yet she stays, maybe because she can't leave, maybe because she hasn't decided, maybe because some hidden thread still binds her here. Scholars still argue over this point. Were Swan Maidens trapped by stolen feathers, or were they choosing to linger out of some complicated love? Was it imprisonment or commitment? Nobody agrees, and maybe that's the whole point. A breeze stirs the reeds, and the river hums with its low, secret voice. The Swan Maiden presses her palm flat against the surface as if sealing a pact, then rises and walks back to the cottage. You stay behind, staring at the current, half expecting it to rise up and swallow you whole. Instead, it just keeps flowing, patient, steady, timeless, like it knows the ending long before you do. The following days drift by like lazy clouds, each one tinged with that same quiet unease. The Swan Maiden goes about her tasks, baking bread, gathering herbs, smiling politely when neighbors greet her, but her eyes keep sliding toward the horizon where the river bends. It's like watching someone check their phone every 2 minutes, except instead of scrolling memes, she's scrolling the current. You notice how the villagers talk. They admire her beauty, of course, because apparently in fairy tales you have to mention that at least 17 times, but they also whisper about her strangeness. She listens to water more than people, one says. She hums songs none of us know, another adds. You nod along, pretending to be chill, though inside you're screaming, yes, she's unusual, but maybe unusual is what we all secretly want. Historically, villagers often treated outsiders with suspicion. In medieval Europe, women who sang strange songs or wandered near rivers were sometimes branded as witches, or worse, recruiters for merfolk cults. Folklorists note that Swan Maidens often embodied that delicate line between fascination and fear, too wondrous to ignore, too uncanny to fully embrace. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Finland, there was once a belief that if you whispered your troubles into a flowing stream, the river would carry them away. Basically the medieval version of journaling. The Swan Maiden seems to live by that rule, though instead of whispering worries, she's pouring her whole soul into the water. At night, you watch her step quietly outside, thinking no one notices. She goes barefoot to the bank, sits under the moonlight, and dips her feet in as though she's clocking into her real shift, being herself. You're tempted to join, but there's a hesitation, like intruding on someone's diary. And here's where scholars still debate. Does the Swan Maiden secretly resent her life among humans, or does she carry both worlds equally, like twin stars orbiting inside her? One camp argues she's biding her time until escape. Another insists her return to water is ritual, not rebellion. Both sound convincing. Both are probably wrong. She comes back to bed each time, shivering faintly, smelling of river mist. You lie awake, listening to the drip of water from her hair onto the floor, one drop at a time. It's hypnotic, like a metronome ticking out the tempo of a life split between land and water. And you can't help but think, one day, maybe soon, she won't come back. One morning, The river doesn't just whisper, it roars. Heavy rains upriver have swollen the current, and the waters churn like a restless animal in its pen. The Swan Maiden stands at the bank, her hair whipped by the wind, her eyes glowing with a kind of recognition. You'd think she was greeting an old friend who'd just crashed the party with way too much energy. The villagers gather nervously. They mutter about flooding, about the crops, about moving the goats to higher ground. But the Swan Maiden doesn't look afraid. She looks alive. You realize this storm doesn't frighten her, it calls her. Historically, rivers and flood were both feared and revered. Ancient Celts believed overflowing rivers were the anger or generosity of deities. Folklorists often tie swan maidens to these moods of nature, serene when the waters are calm, fierce when the torrents rise. They're not just women who transform, they are reflections of the river itself. Here's your quirky tidbit of the day. In medieval France, there was a superstition that swans could predict floods. If they gathered in unusual numbers, villagers braced themselves. Imagine your weather app being a group of moody birds who honk at you instead of sending push notifications. The Swan Maiden edges closer to the current, and you instinctively reach out, fingers brushing her sleeve. She glances back, and for once, she doesn't mask her longing. It's plain, open, and so sharp it almost cuts you. You feel like you're standing between her and oxygen. She doesn't jump in, at least not yet. Instead, she whispers something under her breath, a word that might be prayer or promise, and the river seems to soften just slightly. The villagers, none the wiser, take it as luck, but you know better. You've seen the way the water listens to her. Scholars still argue whether such moments in these tales are proof of the maiden's divine connection or simply poetic storytelling added centuries later. Was she meant to be a goddess in disguise, or just a mortal caught between two worlds? The jury's been out for hundreds of years, and honestly, they'll probably keep fighting about it until the sun explodes. By nightfall, the water's calm, but you can't shake the feeling that the river is only waiting for her, waiting for the moment when she finally lets go of this half-life and surrenders to the current completely. And in that thought lies your quiet dread, that when she does, she won't look back. The days after the flood feel different, like the whole village is holding its breath. You notice the Swan Maiden even more restless than the four. She lingers by the river in broad daylight now, not bothering to hide it, as though secrecy is just too exhausting. You trail behind her one morning, and the reeds part around her like they're welcoming back their favorite guest star. She kneels, cupping water into her hands, drinking as if it carries more than refreshment, like it's medicine, memory, and music all at once. You can't help thinking of how humans scroll their playlists when they're homesick, except her playlist is literally liquid. Historically, many cultures tied swans to transformation and liminality. The Greeks told of Zeus transforming into a swan to court Leda, while Norse legends described Valkyries arriving as swans before shifting into women. Folklorists argue the motif reflects the human obsession with thresholds, water and land, mortal and divine, freedom and commitment. The Swan Maiden embodies all of it, standing half in one world and half in another. Your quirky tidbit? In parts of Ireland, swans were believed to be enchanted humans under curses that lasted hundreds of years. People swore not to harm them because, honestly, who wants to be the guy who accidentally barbecued someone's grandmother? The villagers gossip louder now. She doesn't belong here, someone whispers at the market. She's too strange. They say it with the same tone people use when someone brings kale chips to a barbecue, equal parts suspicion and confusion. You defend her, though, quietly, because you're not ready to admit to anyone else how much you've noticed. One evening, she confides, softly, almost as if apologizing, that she dreams of wings every night, not just wearing them, but being them. You joke lightly, something about how you once dreamed of being a donut, but the smile she gives you is thin, almost pitying. She's not laughing because to her, this isn't a dream. It's a memory. Folklorists still debate. Do swan maidens dream of their wings because they're symbols of freedom, or because those dreams are fragments of an actual past life? Some scholars argue it's just metaphor. Others insist the myth preserves a real belief in soul travel. Nobody agrees, but the ambiguity feels fitting. You lie awake that night, watching her silhouette against the window. The moonlight catches her profile, and for a moment, you swear you see feathers ripple where her hair should be. Then you blink, and it's gone. But the image sticks, and with it, one certainty. This can't last. She is already halfway gone.
The rhythm of your days becomes strange. Mornings filled with ordinary chores, evenings laced with quiet dread, and nights haunted by dreams where feathers drift across the floor like forgotten notes of a song. The Swan Maiden speaks less now, but when she does, her words circle back to the river, its glow, its voice, its endless pull. It's like living with someone who's already packing for a trip they haven't admitted they're taking. One afternoon, you follow her to a meadow near the water's bend. She lies in the tall grass, staring at the sky as though searching for invisible wings overhead. "Do you ever feel," she asks softly, "that the ground doesn't belong to you?" You want to say no, that you're perfectly content with dirt and fields and goat-related taxes, but instead you mumble something halfway honest. Sometimes. Historically, swan maidens often posed this very question, though not verbatim, of course. In Nordic ballads, they asked mortal lovers to choose between life on land or beneath the waves. Folklorists suggest these choices mirrored real-life anxieties about marriage, duty, and the loss of personal freedom. Choosing land meant comfort and family. Choosing water meant wildness and solitude. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Scottish folklore, it was believed that swans could guide lost souls to the afterlife. Not only were they creatures of beauty, but also psychopomps, escorts across the ultimate threshold. Which makes you wonder, when the Swan Maiden stares at the sky, is she dreaming of freedom, or of carrying someone else into a place you can't follow? The meadow hums with bees. You try to lighten the mood by pointing out one buzzing so loudly it could qualify for a heavy metal band. She chuckles faintly, but her laughter fades as quickly as it came, like sunlight behind clouds. And then comes the question you dread. "If I left," she says, her voice trembling like reeds in the wind, "would you follow?" You want to blurt out yes. You want to prove yourself the kind of hero who leaps headfirst into enchanted rivers without a second thought. But honesty sticks in your throat. You know what it would cost. Your fields, your family, your very humanity. Folklorists still argue, were these questions tests of love or warnings cloaked as riddles? Did swan maidens truly want their lovers to follow, or were they simply reminding them of the impossibility of bridging two worlds? Scholars can't agree, and neither can you. You don't answer. She doesn't push. But the silence between you feels heavier than any spoken word. That night, you lie awake again, listening to the steady rush of the river outside. You realize the water doesn't sound the same anymore. It no longer soothes. It taunts. It waits. It reminds you of the answer you couldn't give. And you begin to wonder if that silence was the real beginning of the end.
The shift is subtle at first. The Swan Maiden moves with a kind of distance, like she's rehearsing her goodbyes without saying them aloud. She still helps knead dough, still greets the neighbors politely, But her smile has that practiced quality, like when you say, "I'm fine," while internally planning your dramatic escape into the mountains. You catch her at the river one twilight, the sky bruised purple and gold. She stands ankle-deep, skirts trailing, eyes locked on the horizon. When you call her name, she turns, but her gaze lingers behind you, as if she's already looking past this life, past you, toward the place she knows she must return. Historically, this moment always comes. Folklorists point out that Swan Maiden stories rarely end with permanence. They're transitional tales, not happily ever afters. They remind listeners that liminal beings, whether swans, selkies, or river spirits, cannot be bound forever. Even if you hide their feathered cloaks or beg them to stay, eventually the call of their true home outweighs any mortal tether. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some Russian variants of the Swan Maiden tale, husbands who tried to chain or bind their wives were punished by waking up surrounded by angry birds pecking their roofs apart. Imagine explaining that to your insurance company. That evening, she hums a song you've never heard before. It's soft, lilting, and not in any language you know. The sound makes the river shiver, sending concentric ripples outward. You can't decide if it's beautiful or heartbreaking. Probably both. You make a joke, clumsily, about her trying out for a fantasy version of The Voice. She smiles faintly but doesn't laugh. The truth hovers between you. Her voice doesn't belong here. Not entirely. Folklorists still debate whether Swan Maidens left out of longing or inevitability. Was it agency or destiny? A few argue that these tales reflect women's desire for independence. Others claim it's about inevitability of change, how no love, however sincere, can freeze someone into a shape that isn't theirs. You walk back from the river with you, arm brushing yours, but it feels like holding the edge of a dream. The closer she is, the more you sense she's already gone. And as you both step into the cottage, you realize the hardest part isn't losing her. It's knowing she was never yours to keep.
The night of decision arrives without fanfare. No thundering, no flashing omens, just a clear sky with stars scattered like spilled sugar. The village is asleep, the hearth fire burned down to embers, and you wake to find the bed beside you empty. You already know where she's gone. Your feet carry you to the river before your mind catches up, each step heavy like you're trudging through molasses. And there she is, the Swan Maiden, standing knee-deep in the silver water, moonlight gleaming off her hair. At her side lies something you've never seen before. Feathers, gleaming, soft as mist. You realize, with a hollow twist in your chest, that she's found what was hidden. Or perhaps the river itself returned it? Historically, this is the inevitable climax. In most versions of the tale, the maiden reclaims her wings and departs, leaving her mortal companion behind. Folklorists suggest the motif embodies the sorrow of impermanence, the truth that even love can't anchor someone who belongs elsewhere. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some Estonian folk tales, swan maidens didn't just leave quietly. They sometimes took their children with them, raising them in watery kingdoms beneath the lakes. So, if you ever wondered where all the lost socks go, maybe they're hanging on a clothesline in some swan-run underwater cottage. She lifts the feathers slowly, reverently, like holding the memory of her entire being. She glances back at you once. The silence stretches heavy and soft, like a quilt you don't want to pull off. You want to shout, to plead, to make a joke about how return policies don't usually cover magical garments, but instead you manage only a whisper. Do you have to? Her eyes shimmer, filled with both sorrow and certainty. She says, I always did, and you know she's right. Scholars still argue over the moral here. Was the Swan Maiden's departure punishment for human greed, or was it simply the natural order asserting itself? Some claim it's a cautionary tale about trying to control what cannot be owned. Others insist it's about respecting the freedom of those we love. Whatever the truth, the river begins to glow faintly as she drapes the feathers over her shoulders. Light ripples outward, and you understand, this isn't just a departure, it's a homecoming. And you, standing on the bank, are left with the choice of whether to bless it or break under it.
The feathers settle onto her shoulders like they never left. A shimmer runs along her skin, and for a moment she is both woman and bird, hair fading into down, arms lengthening into wings. It's not grotesque, not frightening. It's graceful, inevitable, like watching frost lace across glass. You realize this isn't transformation, it's restoration. She isn't becoming something new, she's becoming herself again. You stand frozen, every thought in your head screaming, "Don't let her go!" But your body knows better. You don't reach out. You don't snatch the feathers away. You only watch. Because some loves are measured not by possession, but by the willingness to see them soar. Historically, endings like this often left listeners unsettled. No happily ever after, no wedding feast, just absence. Folklorists explain that Swan Maiden tales carry an older rhythm than fairy tale finales. They belong to myths where longing and loss are inseparable from beauty. The story is not about winning, but about witnessing. Your quirky tidbit: in one Polish version, the mortal man tried to tie a ribbon to the swan's leg so she'd remember him. But when she flew, the ribbon snapped, fluttering back into his hands. Villagers claimed ribbons found by rivers were remnants of such partings, tokens of love, but also reminders that some bonds are not meant to bind. The Swan Maiden's eyes lock on yours one last time. There's gratitude there, maybe even tenderness, but not regret. She whispers something, too soft to catch, and then her body lifts, wings unfurling with a sound like silk torn gently in half. The river mirrors her ascent, rippling silver beneath her. You want to joke about how she forgot to leave a forwarding address, but the lump in your throat steals the words. You only watch as she circles once overhead, then disappears into the horizon where sky and water blur together. The reeds hush. The village sleeps on, unaware that a chapter has ended. You remain on the bank until dawn, when the first light paints the current gold. The river looks ordinary again, but you know better. It has taken her back, not as a thief, but as a keeper of promises older than memory. Scholars will forever debate the meaning of her return, but you, standing alone with the morning mist curling around your ankles, understand something simpler. You were allowed to walk beside her for a time, and that was enough. And maybe, when the river sings at night, it will carry her voice, faint, fleeting, but real.
And now, as the story softens to its close, let yourself drift with the river too. The Swan Maiden has gone, her wings spread into the distance, and all that remains is the hush of flowing water and the faint memory of her voice. Breathe in deeply, as though you are inhaling that river air, cool, clean, carrying the scent of reeds and distant rain. Let your breath fall slowly, like feathers settling onto the surface of the current. Each inhale, each exhale, brings you further away from the weight of the day and closer into rest. The meadow is still, the stars linger above, and the village sleeps on without stir. You are safe here, wrapped in the softest of silences. Imagine the gentle lapping of the current as a lullaby, steady and eternal, carrying away any last thoughts that cling like leaves on the shore. If worries come, let them float downstream, small as twigs, vanishing into the silver horizon. What remains is only the quiet, the calm, the tender memory of wings against the night sky. The story has ended, but its peace stays with you. You may find her voice again in dreams, or in the hush of wind through the trees, or simply in the comfort of knowing that beauty, once encountered, never truly leaves. Now allow yourself to soften, to sink into your bed the way stones settle gently into sand at the bottom of a stream. There is nothing more to do, nowhere else to be, only this calm, this quiet, this drifting rest. Good night, traveler. Sleep well.